multilateralism, and with very prestigious and very experienced and also young, sometimes young speakers that will intervene in the different parts of the debate. Just to give you a few speaking rules, so everybody's allowed to speak in its own language, except me. I was pressured to speak English, so it's not your chance, but that's it. Now you have received, if at the entrance you have received the bios of all the speakers, of all those who will intervene tonight, as well as the program that I just repeat in the very great lines. So we first start with a summary of the online survey that was done by Grey Cells with the former civil servants and also the general public here in Geneva. After that, we'll follow up with the presentation of the book about Eric Drummond in the times of the League of Nations, presented by the author or co-author of the book, John Burley. It will be followed by the presentation of the UN project of 100 Years of Multilateralism by Francesco Pisano, director of the Library and Archives of the UN office in Geneva, who made us the honor to be with us. I just talked a little bit with him about this huge project that the archives and the library are processing right now. Very interesting. You will have to come back to explain us more in details another time, but tonight it's multilateralism, the topic, but very interesting. And these two debates, these two presentations will for sure inspire us and inspire the speakers of the two debates that will follow. The first one is is called Neutrality, Independence, Impartiality of the ICS, 100 Years of Success and Failure. And it will be the opportunity also to have some real life experience from the different speakers, and some hopes or perhaps threats from the newer ones that engage in the international civil service. And then this will last about 1 hour, this debate. You will have 15 minutes at the end to ask your question. Then second debate is about multilateralism, and we will have another set of speakers to talk about how can the international civil servants defend the purpose and of multilateralism. So, but I suggest we start right away, and we start with the president of Grey Cells, Alejandro Bonilla Gracia, and who will present us the survey. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Well, on behalf of Grey Cells, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for participating in this third intergenerational dialogue. The first one was on the SDGs, the second one on gender issues, and this on the international civil service. And I just realized that some of you didn't know what Grey Cells was, so I will just take a few moments to mention what we do. We are all former international civil servants, and we loved so much our activity that we continue to do it for free, with NGOs, with universities, with missions, with United Nations, with the closest of the press, to whoever asked us to do and to collaborate. We loved our career, and that's possibly the passion that moved us to organize this session. And I will be very brief. I will not present the whole results of the survey. They are quite abundant. There is at the entrance a summary of them, and we will put in our webpage, the Grey Cells webpage, all the results with the data and with some basic interpretation. We received comments from 30 different nationalities, young and less young people, some who were former international civil servants, and many who didn't even know what an international civil servant was. So the responses are very different from one group to the other, from one generation to the other. And just I would like just to remember Gabriel Garcia Marquez, when his Nobel speech, he mentioned that there is one word that he gives the very high importance, and that one word is gracias in español, merci en français, and two words in English, thank you. I would like to thank you, all those who participated, because being here, it's going to be, I think it's going to be great. We're going to spend an hour and a half, almost 2 hours, possibly together, including the cocktail. But the journey that took us here has been fantastic. Being the seniors, former international civil servants, with young people that will be participating has been really very, very enriching. So thank you very much to Ji-Moon. Thank you very much for United Nations. Thank you very much to Young UN, to Parlement des Jeunes Genevois, to Rotaract Geneva International, to the University of Geneva, to Fair Internship Initiative, to GAGI, and of course to the Club Suisse de la Presse for hosting us, and very especially to the Library of UNOC, particularly Mr. Francesco Pisano and Stefan Vukovic, because they gave us a lot of material that will be at the base of the debate, at the base of the documents, and the films that we were projecting. By the way, this session is being recorded, and it will be edited and put in a shorter version in our website. So thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you very much to all of you for being here. And if I could just have the PowerPoint, just to give you a glimpse of 2 or 3 very strong messages. This is one of the questions that was sent through internet, and is, have you experienced personally, or are you aware of cases where the neutrality or independence of an official has not been respected? And if you see the response, seniors, they responded 100%. So all seniors that replied to the questionnaire mentioned that they were subject of cases where the independence was not respected. The Generation X, who are those who were born between 1965 and 1979, they're just half the way. Half of them have been, they will be, possibly. And the millennials, they are just 1/4 away. So it really reflects that the more time you spend, the more time you're possibly subject to not be respected your independence. Sorry, it's the other way around. And what was the cause of this non-respect? And if you see, the 2 main causes are pressure from your superiors, the yellow one for the senior, or was because of pressure from a member state. Those were the majority for the seniors, and also for the 3 other generations. I will move forward. Let me see. To this one, about expectations. How do you see the future compared to the past 20 or 30 years? Do you think that the professional international civil servant among the public opinion in general is nowadays more complicated and less appreciated? There's a mistake there. But you see, the gray part of all the graphs is that it's going to be more complicated. And also about the future, and I will stop here. In your opinion, in the next 10 to 15 years, multilateralism and its corollary, international civil service, will be weakened for the majority, 3 generations, and will change radically. Seniors and Generation X, they think that it will change radically. So the expectations is that multilateralism is going to be weakened, the international civil service too, and that it will change radically, or it has to be changed radically. If you read the newspapers today, there was a session just yesterday at the World Economic Forum, and the main issue was the resistance to change. And there was an invitation not to resist change, but work for the change on the right way. So the whole analysis of the results are in a summary at the entrance, and the rest will be posted in our webpage. So I will stop here in order to go to the substance and to the objective of this session. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you very much. So I give the floor to John Burley, who will present us the book Eric Drummond and His Legacies. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you to Graycells for the opportunity to speak about the book which I co-authored with 3 other British colleagues. In fact, I'm not going to tell you in detail what is in the book. I'm going to talk about Eric Drummond and what happened 100 years ago for the creation of the International Civil Service. In all its essential respects, the International Civil Service, the ISC, dates from the League of Nations. And in that regard, it is the one feature of the League that was not a failure. So I'm going to make 3 short remarks. How, out of the ashes of the First World War, a completely novel entity in international affairs, namely an international administration with executive functions, emerged. Secondly, I recall the basic principles and characteristics of that international administration. And thirdly, I will remind us all of the legacies of the League which transited to the United Nations. 100 years ago, the victorious powers in the Great War accepted Woodrow Wilson's proposals, ideas for an international organization, but there was no consensus at all on the nature of a secretariat which will be necessary to support such a venture. There were, broadly speaking, 2 schools of thought. There was the orthodox view, which was propagated by an influential British civil servant who was secretary of the Paris Conference, Maurice Hankey, who didn't really believe in the League, and who felt that the League should be staffed by diplomats seconded from their national ministries of foreign affairs to the League Secretariat for short periods of time to undertake specific tasks. Fortunately, Maurice Hankey refused the job as the Secretary General of the League. And it went to his subordinate, Eric Drummond, whom the French Premier Georges Clemenceau proposed for appointment as a Secretary General. Drummond was a convinced internationalist. He believed in countries working together to solve common problems. He was probably influenced by something which happened in London towards the end of the First World War, whereby a group of officials from France, from Britain, from Italy, and eventually from America and the United States when they joined the war, who coordinated the best possible use of the maritime transport capacity in the Allied countries, in order to make sure that the right amount of medicine, food supplies, and armaments were transported to the right place at the right time. This was a very successful experiment. It's the first case, I think, of international functional cooperation, and it shortened the war. And many of the senior officials associated with that agreed to join Eric Drummond in setting up the League of Nations Secretariat. That took place over a matter of a few weeks in the summer of 1919. Drummond worked closely with his deputy, whom some of you may know, but it's not generally known, that the eminent Frenchman Jean Monnet, who was the European Union founder, worked on this scheme and was heavily instrumental in the setting up of the League. All this was done without any guidance from governments. They had nothing at all, but it worked well to such an extent that the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Balfour, was able to make a statement at the Council of the League in Rome in May of 1920. The statement was in fact drafted by Eric Drummond himself, and I quote it, members of a secretariat, once appointed, are no longer the servants of the country of which they are the citizens, but become for the time being the servants only of the League of Nations. Their duties are not national but international. Drummond built on this statement, which had the consensus of members of the Council at the time, and set forth the principles under which the Secretariat would function. Before I come to that, I'd like to say something about Eric Drummond himself. He was a Scottish aristocrat from the Perth family, modest and self-effacing. He created, by example, trust in the Secretariat and with member states, because staff from the different nationalities were treated in the same way, they had the same opportunities, and they perceived themselves to be working for the same purposes. Drummond was recognized for his sense of fairness, his careful attention to detail, and his constant hard work. And these qualities allowed him to build up and direct, for 14 years, he's the longest ever serving Secretary General, a permanent international civil service known for its high standards of integrity, impartiality, and efficiency. Now, the essential features of an international administration that Drummond set forth are very familiar to yours, so I can be very brief. The principle of loyalty to the international organization. This doesn't mean foregoing your national identity, but it does mean that strict loyalty to the international interests take precedence. The principle of independence in two respects. First, the obligation for staff not to seek or receive instruction from governments, and the complementary enjoinment on the governments not to seek to influence. And secondly, for that time, the entirely revolutionary notion that an international secretariat is an actor in its own right in international affairs. Then, of course, we have the principle of impartiality, integrity, and objectivity. And finally, the principle of an active and responsive international administration acting solely in the interests of an international community and its internationally agreed standards and obligations. These principles were new for the time. The executive function today is, of course, totally normal, but in those days it was anything but. Now, in contrary to the political and security failures of the League, all other aspects of the League have stood the test of time. So my third point is simply to recall some of those things which the League passed to the UN and to the specialized agencies. In contrast to the covenant of the League, which was silent on the responsibilities of the Secretariat, the UN Charter is much more explicit. Franklin Roosevelt, the US President, was desperate to protect his new world organization against contamination from an association with the League that, as you all know, 25 years earlier, the Senate, US Senate had rejected. So the United States could never publicly recognize what was good about the League. Nevertheless, the Americans in 1945 at San Francisco understood the need for an effective and independent secretariat, and thus the Charter defines the Secretariat as one of the principal organs of the new United Nations with its own rights and responsibilities. Article 99 of the Charter allows the Secretary General to alert the Security Council on issues of peace and security. This article, in fact, has provided the basis for a proactive Secretariat on a range of issues. That article is drawn directly from the experience of the League and also from Drummond's advice to British officials who were drafting the League. Article 100 of the Charter adopts what Drummond had put in place as regards the independence of the Secretariat and its exclusively international status. Drummond introduced an oath of office for League officials. This was taken over by the UN for UN officials, and the wording is exactly the same. The list could go on and on. The UN structures, its methods of work, the functioning of a secretary and its responsibilities, the staff regulations and rules, including the method of calculation of salary scales, relationships with civil society, importance of public information, and much more are all based on League precedents. The Manuela Totoya's paper for this dialogue goes into many of these issues. It highlights the seamlessness of the 100-year history of the ICS that is now being commemorated, and we'll hear in a moment more about that. It recalls also the great Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, who did much to codify and set out the principles on which the ICS could function. In doing so, Hammarskjöld made clear his debt to Drummond. In 1956, he said to the press, and I quote, "In the whole field of international politics, one of the most radical innovations was the creation of an international secretariat as something lifted above all national contexts. I admire the way Eric Drummond gave it body and weight. We have had to repeat the experiment. I personally learned very much from both the difficulties and the principles of the first experiment," and Hammarskjöld repeated the same sentiments in his Oxford lecture of May 1961. In our book, we call the ICS the glue that holds the multilateral system together. We don't say that the ICS in the days of the League was perfect. Then as now, the ICS has fallen short of the highest standards it should always seek to uphold. But our book shows that the strengths and weaknesses inherent in today's international administrations were present also 100 years ago. But let us also remember that Drummond created a new concept entirely from scratch and nurtured it to such an extent that it survived both the terrible leadership of his successor and the political and economic catastrophes of the 1930s and the Second World War. Then as now, the ICS comprised human beings capable of both good and bad. Then as now, senior political appointees were both excellent and disastrous. Then as now, when the principles of the ICS are followed and respected by both governments and staff, the entire world is better off. Then as now, the ICS is no more and no less than what governments want it to be. My concluding remark is that for the sake of humanity, the ICS has to be preserved, protected, and defended. If the glue comes unstuck, the whole international system collapses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John Burley, for this very interesting view of Eric Drummond's legacy. I now give the floor to Francesco Pisano, director of the library, the UN library in Geneva, who will present us this project of the 100 years of multilateralism. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I know many of you, and thank you to, first of all, Grace Else for inviting me again after last year. I feel that every passing year I qualify better for this ensemble of people and colleagues. But I also see young places, young faces. I see a student from the MEIG. I was lecturing there a couple of weeks ago. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. And thank you to the Club de la Presse for having us. I would like to use these 10 minutes I've been given to, 100 years of multilateralism in 10 minutes, you do the maths. So, but we'll do something else. He spoke about the civil service. I would like to talk more about multilateralism and how we came up with this program. So behind me, maybe, you have the website. So you can go there and see a lot of stuff that is going on in this program, why we did this program, what it is for, and what are the activities. This program, we began this program on the first day of International Day of Multilateralism, 24 April 19, and we're going to end it on 15 November 2020, which is the 100 years after the first assembly of the League of Nations back in 1920. And so one thing in parentheses, if you want to hear more about his book and you want to hear his voice explaining this, I know this is being recorded, but it's also on our webcast. The library at UN has a webcast called The Next Page. It's very easy to find on all the normal platforms. It's red, very nice. And he's there speaking more extensively about the book and about this essential figure and how unobserved it has gone over the years. And your survey is very, very telling. It's very, very good stuff. But let me go back to why we decided to do this 100 Years of Multilateralism, this program. So we wanted, first of all, to celebrate 100 years of multilateralism in Geneva. So Geneva is this incredible anomaly, which is a positive anomaly. It's like, if you do the historic carrot sampling of multilateralism, in Geneva you go down deep and you go down to day one. And there is only another place on earth that I know of that you can mention for that is Silicon Valley, where you can go down to the origin of the IT domain or industry, as we call it today. So that is Geneva for multilateralism. And this is something that will have to be borne in mind when inevitably, my opinion, we will have to discuss what is needed for the future. Because there is a catch in all this, and I will tell you very soon. So number one, celebrate 100 years of 1 century of modern multilateralism in Geneva. You can't do that anywhere else. If you do it in New York, you have to wait another 35 years. So by then, we will be celebrating 135 years of multilateralism. So the second is to inspire through history. Now, there is something that went on in multilateralism, especially in the last 80 years, 70 years, is a sort of departure of historians from the battleground of decision-making and governance. And those who were left on the battleground, taking decisions, negotiating decisions, didn't run after the historians. So President Wilson, when he had to craft the position of the United States vis-à-vis this organization still yet to be born, called the best historians in the country, sat down with them and figured out what were the opportunities and the threats. This hasn't been done consistently through history. So this is the first thing that we wanted to do, is to bring history, not for the pleasure of, which might seem very Geneva and always looking back, we have this, we have had this, etc. No, it's more like taking the history and put it square back under the nose of what you may call in theory global governance. The Twitter version of global governance is much more volatile and much less useful than the one based on history. The third thing, we wanted to make a link. At the end of the 100 Years of Multilateralism in November 2020, we wanted to put a question that now it is also, with great pleasure, put by the Secretary General. What is the multilateralism that we need for the future? Now, this seems so obvious to ask, but it's not. I'll give you an example. 99% of the sources that you can consult today will talk about the future of multilateralism. We want to talk about the multilateralism of the future. And those are two different vehicles. I may be wrong. History will tell. So in 2020, this program, you go in there, you will see a number of things. But in 2020, just to give you the general direction of this program, in 2019, we started presenting historical facts. The flagship project was our combined exhibition together with the Botman Foundation on the other side of the lake, and together with us and this ICRC, us being UN Geneva, and the ICRC on this side of the lake. And so we tapped into history. In 2020, we started looking forward. We will involve much more the youth. We have plans with the city of Geneva, the canton of Geneva, a number of partners. In 19 alone, we ran more than 40 events to celebrate history of multilateralism in various formats. And we have plans for as many in 2020, together with, of course, this is not just UN. It's really the international Geneva at play. And then we're going to get also a little bit more Genevan in a way. We have a crowdsourcing project where we go and chase those surviving family members of those that were in the Secretariat at the time of the League of Nations. We're going to use the internet to do that and find them using crowdsourcing activities. And then we try to link it to UN 75. I cannot speak about UN 75 now, we don't have the time, but it's this big initiative to ask the world population, what is the world you want in 2045, and therefore, what is the kind of UN we need to get there. It's a big challenge, and it should be enough to motivate a lot of people. There is a growing discussion going on Multilateralism 100. On social media. So this is also new. There is a lot of social media talking about multilateralism. We wanted to have that word buzz again in the ears of people, because multilateralism has been a word in the past 25 years confined to the circles of people like us who work with the concept. So I want to go faster, and I want to draw some conclusions and take advantage that you're all here. But just the key points in 2020 is the combination of efforts we're going to have with the airport. You know that the airport was part of the bid of Geneva. Geneva had fierce competitors in this game to host the Société des Nations. And one of them was Brussels. Another one was Lausanne. And so Geneva said, hey, we can throw an airport in there. And so, and actually, then they had to throw the airport in there. And so the airport actually is celebrating 100 years. And so next time you take a flight, do that with moderation. You will see stuff about the 100 years of multilateralism there. And then we're going to have an entire multilateral week, the week of 24 April, which is the second International Day of Multilateralism. And so there we will have a number of events. But I'll let you go on the website. There are various sources. Don't forget the podcast, because the podcast has been designed to advance the conversation on multilateralism. And so just to close, I have 3 minutes. Let me tell you something that I told my students at the University of Geneva. There is this growing self-defeating feeling that multilateralism is under attack. I'm sorry to burst the bubble, but it isn't. Because nationalism, as people call it, hasn't been so low in the world since Westphalia. You know, any historians here can tell you. And so what is that we're noticing is perhaps something different. One is the mismatch between the new expectations of world populations at play in multilateralism. Before, there were nice diplomats with long white socks talking about things that their governments had told them to say. And now you've got, hundreds of millions of people linked on the internet live commenting on things and say, this is what we want. And so that is one mismatch of expectations. So I think we should, let me use 3 minutes to tell you what multilateralism is not and how it gets hit on the head. Number one is not just a diplomatic practice. And this is too often confused by observers. The multilateralism implies a commitment to values, a respect for the rules of the game. And so every time you depart from these values, or you pretend you're respecting the value, but you don't, you put multilateralism similarly under pressure. Actually, you are just cheating. It's not multilateralism under pressure. The rules are clear. The second thing that multilateralism is not a recipe for harmony. It's never been. No one said, take this pill and everybody will love each other. Multilateralism has always been a way to put together compelling national different interests and very often conflicting interests. So it's not harmony. It's not the meditation practice of the international community. And so when you say, you guys were meditating and we still have war, this is a failure of multilateralism, well, a 7th grader could say, no, it's not. The third thing that is not a method to achieve quick results. We live in a time where people measure what's happening in terms of weeks. We've been talking about this for 3 weeks and it hasn't happened yet. Failure of multilateralism. Again, multilateralism is there to guarantee long stability in the long term, so it's an inspirational set of things. Today, the UN is important, whether or not it is reformed, whether or not it takes water, because it's the only place where these principles and values and rules of the game are conserved, enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. So until we have another place, another sort of safe in which these principles are enshrined and protected, we ought to protect the United Nations. It's very simple. It's the only hospital in town. It's not because it's not perfect that we start destroying it. And so this is something that we have to keep in mind as we go to the future. And the future is made essentially of this question. However good or bad, is this formula of multilateralism what we need for the future? And the answer is no. Because the current multilateralism has been designed to support something that we call today globalization. A race of competing national interests combined into something that is sustainable in the medium course. That's how we avoid wars. But going forward, the problems have become global, not national. They're not domestic anymore. And so we need something better. So I think, and I repeat, nationalism is up. Are you sure about that? Because by the numbers, it's not up. What you are observing is a transition time between something that has worked, more or less, but it has kept us at peace for 75 years, and what is coming at us. And because we're humans, and we have instincts, we know what's coming at us. We know it when we're 16, Greta and company. We know it when we are grayer, like me, and we know it when you're gray cells, like him. We do know it. So if you look at yourself in the mirror long enough, you will know that it's all a question of what multilateralism we need for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just trying to put on my mic. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Two excellent presentations. It was very interesting to always discover some new insights of Geneva. Even if you live in the city for a very long time, you learn every day more and more. And I'm happy that the UN, the library, you give us this very in-depth view of what Geneva has brought to the multilateralism. Very interesting. So let's try if it works now. So, okay, yes. So if you don't mind, we are going to pass to the first panel. So if the first panel here would come up to the stage, perhaps can you take your little, how you say it, yes, thank you very much. So that everybody knows who is speaking tonight. And thanks you again, gentlemen, for this very interesting discussion. I won't make a long introduction of each of you. You all know that you got, there is a sheet with all the bios and the profiles of the ladies and gentlemen that are on stage. Actually, I can't summarize them because they are much too impressive and much too long, so you better read it during that time. Welcome to all of you. In this first part, let me make a little bit some, yeah. So in this first part, we are going to discuss neutrality, independence, impartiality of the ICS, 100 years of success and failure, individual experiences of serving and retired civil servants. That's you. And new civil servants too. And actually, I didn't know a lot of this topic, but I was talking with you yesterday, and I went a little bit more in depth today about this. Very, very interesting, and I'm very keen to actually know. First question, perhaps to the more experienced of you. What was said to you when you signed up in the UN system for a job? What was said to you about obligation or not obligation of neutrality, independence? Was this a topic at that moment when you started your job at the UN? Perhaps Mr. Tapiola from the ILO, if you can start.
Yes, well, the answer, my answer is simply nothing. Nobody gave me instructions. I mean, most of the things you have to work out yourself. But I suppose that is what happens in work life anyway. Gradually, you come. I mean, you always come up to the question of neutrality, but everyone wants you to be neutral. Everyone wants the international civil servant to be neutral, but they also want him or her to agree with them. And that is the problem.
And you have many people to agree with, if I understand.
You see, if I'm looking at it from the point of view of the ILO, so it's easy to say that I have always been in jobs where basically I have an alibi for being neutral from governments. But then I come from the workers' group. And then I've got somewhere behind there's a group which always has expected me to behave in a certain way. And finding, the balance between that and getting a sensible outcome is not one of the easiest things. But
right. So your job was to be dependent of this of the working group. Actually, you had to represent them. So you were not really neutral.
You see, for most of the time, I think that they thought that I was representing them, and I thought that my basic task was to make them understand what is the best decision in their interest, which they did not always immediately see.
Todd Holland, thank you. Todd Holland, you are working at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Same question for you. What is your perception of this obligation of neutrality? Were you aware of this when you started at the very beginning in your job? Was it something that you were just discussing at least with yourself, perhaps?
Well, I think it's a really good question because I've never considered myself to work for a neutral organization. Because coming in and being recruited by the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, we have 10 treaties that are our collective values. And so I always felt that I worked for a value-based organization. And that certainly the relationships with member states have always been a bit complicated because these member states have signed on voluntarily to these treaties. And so the basis of our relationship is that normative framework. But it is a difficult one because I can't tell you how many times I've been called by, let's say, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, asking me what I'm doing. And that I usually take that as an opportunity to explain, well, I'm doing my job. Because you've signed on to these treaties. But it is a very difficult one because I think oftentimes people, we confuse the concept of neutrality. And because it reflects different parts of what we do, but it doesn't reflect us. I mean, neutral we're not like going nowhere. We should be going somewhere. So, but I do want to say that it was 31 years after my first job in the UN that I signed the oath of civil service. So it did take a little while for that formal process to reach me.
And when you signed it, you were persuaded that it was anyway not neutral, or?
Well, we had actually really good. It was when I was representative of OHCHR in Colombia. We had a very good discussion about the issue of neutrality at that time. Because it reflects how we should relate to the, let's say, the stakeholders, the member states, and how they should relate to us. But, we're very clear, especially at our office, we're a values-based organization, and I think people understand that when they start.
Thank you. Priska Shawi, you are really at at the center, at the convergence of these questions concerning all the civil servants. You are the executive secretary of the UNOG staff coordinating council and staff. How do you feel, what's the real importance in your view of these three values, again, independence, impartiality, and neutrality? Is it really something that is of core importance in the UN system, or can you forget it in a certain way?
So thank you very much for this question. I mean, for me, as John has said in his introduction, I mean, the ICSC, it's the core of the multilateralism. And when you see what is the three values, which are neutrality, independence, and impartiality, for me, it's part of what we have to be as international civil servant. This being said, if you see the history, and then we mentioned, how it's evolved, how it started, what was requested from us, what was the ideas of Drummond, and where we are today, you just question. And this is not because of us as international civil servants, but if I may say, it's because of the pressures, the financial pressures that being put on the organization, that is making a lot of these value not shrinking, but I can say that they are no more strong like before. I give you an example. When you have like some department like OCHA, which are like 90% based on extra budgetary funds, and then you need the program to go ahead till the end, and you need to have senior manager trying to get the money by all means. I'm not saying by dirty means, but by all means. So at a certain point, if you want the organization to continue, this neutrality in a way, independence and impartiality is being put into question. If you want to continue to serve the organization, which is, as John has said, Todd has said, is an organization based on values. And these values are at the core of our work, but I have to say that the pressure that is being exerted on us today isn't making our work as easy as it should have been.
Thank you. And now I turn to the younger generation. Arabella, come in. So you are intern at the United Nations Environment Program and member of the FAIR Internship Initiative. So these values, is this really a concern for you? Is this something that you reach for in this job, or is it just a side, a lateral kind of values, and what you want actually is a job at the United Nations?
You mean the value of neutrality?
Yeah.
I think it's a difficult conversation to have, because I agree with what you said about it being, in my mind, more of a value-based organization as opposed to necessarily at its heart the UN being a neutral organization. And I think part of what comes into that is how you understand neutrality, because the neutrality that I think the UN should embody is a more proactive neutrality, something that is visible in, for example, the responsibility to protect doctrine. And I think that is something that I am interested in. I think that joining an organization like the UN, where everything is supposed to be based on these core values, I think it's necessary to remain neutral for political purposes, but ultimately the goal and the aim of the organization is to protect the values upon which they're based and around which the work is focused. And so, although neutrality is important, it is not, for me, necessarily the be-all and end-all. I think the values and upholding them and making sure that the work truly reflects those values is more important than necessarily being true neutral in all cases.
Thank you. Now, Enkel Lescage, you are from the University of Geneva.
Yes.
And you're currently conducting a Master of Advanced Studies in European and International Governance. So what is your take? You have a more global view, if I understand, a little bit exterior view of what's going on with these type of questions. What's your view of the importance of these values today in the system?
Well, thank you. I'm in a stage in my career where I'm getting to learn about these values. I'm neither a retired civil servant nor an active one. We have a class, for example, with Professor Brownie where we go in depth about issues like this, but In my perspective, I think that there are some global challenges right now, like climate challenge, cybersecurity. And when you think about them, you start thinking that these challenges will promote neutrality because it's the only way to address them. So if you're thinking from a country's perspective still, or if you're getting influence from a country's perspective, how do you deal with climate change? It's in the door of everybody. How do you deal with cybersecurity? In my mind, also in my generation's mind, I guess, neutrality is kind of given. You have to have it embedded in your values, and I think we kind of start from that point. Yeah.
Yeah. So in certain way, you're talking about common interest for these very important issues. At the same time, the stakes are so high that the positions, for sure, of the different states are very, very different. And the trend is, as we saw in the survey, is to put some pressure on the international civil servants. And this is my question now to those who have an experience inside of the UN system. How did you experience those pressure? We could see that in the survey, I guess 100% of those who were for a longer time in the system experienced pressure, and the younger ones less. So first question, perhaps, is it because the younger ones have less experience and had less opportunity in the time frame to be under pressure, or is it that it has changed from your time at the very beginning and now where there is less pressure? So perhaps Mr. Tapiola.
Yes, well, I don't think that it reflects some change. It's just rather normal that if you take the elder generation, so they're more liable to be in positions where they have been directly under pressure. It does not always come to junior or medium level, but it certainly comes to the highest, to the top level. It does, and it has to come. It's normal. In a organization like the ILO, so you have certain. You have the whole body of standards, and then you come under pressure when governments don't like the way that their behavior is being interpreted. And then they start putting pressure on to find, let's say, the interpretation that they would like to have. It's part of the whole exercise. If you know what you're dealing with, you know how far you can go. You can think of how much flexibility there is in each of the issues. You can try to work it out from the outcome or so on. But there's also four organizations like the ILO. I started my professional career and political professional career in the 1960s, early 70s, when we were often, and I come from Finland, so we were often criticized for that in the Cold War period we did not take very straightforward positions regarding a little neighbor that we had, the Soviet Union. We had a president at the time who said that, in this world, there are people, you need both judges and you need doctors. And maybe our role is easier. It's easier to be a judge, to be a doctor instead of a judge. This was a Cold War period. And now that we have come to a different period, I am more and more starting to think that we need to find a way of reconciling these two, of both being able to do the analysis honestly, saying what is wrong. Your interlocutors will not necessarily like it. Sometimes they will put pressure. They will put a lot of pressure. But then if you start explaining how you could actually solve this question, then you might find another way than, let's say, the traditional judgmental approaches, because they are the ones that provoke political pressure. Now, you take the whole issue of child labor that was discussed over the last 30 years. Governments first said, we don't have the problem, and don't come and put pressure on us. And finally, we got into a point where actually the governments wanted to work on that issue, because that was for them a way of showing that they are doing things right in an acceptable way.
So that means that the pressure came from the UN system on the governments, that they could respond and show that they were doing the job, actually.
For an organization, and I think this goes also for the High Commissioner on Human Rights and so on, I mean, there has to be pressure that comes from the organizations on the governments. And of course, the pressure doesn't come from the Secretariat. It comes from the member countries. So in a way, the countries are pressuring one another. But you have to be able to kind of navigate that in a way that you turn it into an issue of, well, how do you want to solve this question?
One feels a lot of experience behind all what you are saying here. Mr. Holland, could you give us one example on your side of pressure that you improved, that you were under? You are in a very sensitive, you're dealing with very sensitive subject, human rights. So I guess that pressures there can be pretty high. How is it, do they become real? What kind of pressure do you have? Do you have a call from this and this state, which state, to ask you what, and what can you do? What do you do? What don't you do?
Well, again, like my colleague from the ILO, I think it's actually normal. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the position that we're in. But we have to be ready for it. And I think one of the problems that we have is that, to a large degree, once you get beyond the civil service, a lot of people that are appointees aren't necessarily ready in terms of their defense of our own principles. And that's where we end up having problems. I think that, to a large degree, I give you an example. One time I was in Colombia, in Cauca, one of the departments, and we were visiting an indigenous group, and that there was a firefight between the FARC and the government, and that it was unfortunate to be stuck in the community, but it was the community that has been feeling this, not on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. So then the media got a hold of me and said, "Oh, we heard you were in the middle of this firefight." And I said, "Yes, for the people in this particular Indian community or indigenous community, it's normal. It's like having fighting in their backyard. Something like Syria that you see on TV." And then I got a call from the Minister of Foreign Affairs saying, "How dare I compare Colombia to Syria?" And I said, "Oh, I'm very sorry. I'll write an op-ed explaining what I meant," which I did. And so every time she'd call, then I would write an op-ed in one of the main newspapers in the country explaining my point. And so then she didn't call as often. Because, it was true for the people living in the middle of conflict. It wasn't because Bogota was so removed from the armed conflict at that moment, that it was hard for people to understand that you actually did have areas that were affected weekly, if not daily, by the armed conflict. So it was very important to put out that that was happening and that these implicate human rights violations. So, you know, it's not an easy thing. It's not like she became my best friend. But I think that there was a respect there because we didn't back down. And I think we back down way too often today in our organization, especially at higher levels, because people come in when, you know, ask, well, you came into the organization. I knew I came into a values-based organization. You know, I'd studied for it. This is something I wanted to do. I had an experience for it. I was excited about the opportunity. But that the people who are appointed at the highest levels come in for political reasons. And I think that that makes it very difficult if they're also not ready to defend those values, that then you see that the member states find it easier to push, and then it creates limited space on ourselves in terms of functionaries.
So, thank you very much. Mrs. Shawi, you have a kind of cross-cutting of the UN population from the very top to the down. Do you think the values are well defended today by, let's say, the Secretary General and the staff in the General Secretary? How are the values diffused into the staff today?
To say that I can talk about myself when I joined the UN. I mean, I come from a developing country, and then since my childhood I used to dream to be working in the UN, and I joined the UN because of these values that the UN has been preaching and is preaching, and I used to see it was for me the accomplishment of my life. And then when I entered and I started discovering what's going on, I got disappointed. I still believe in the UN today, but unfortunately it's, as de Gaulle used to call it, le gros machin. And it's not, it's a heavy bureaucracy today, I have to say. I would approve what my colleague said about the political appointment, and also what Carrie said, mainly the pressure. I won't feel it as a middle level staff, but you have a lot of political pressure, and you have more and more political appointees in the senior level, and these appointees are not probably not the one who really embraced all the values of the UN, like the young generation. And I was in a way happy when I saw the result of the survey, because it gives some hope, because the new generation is coming with another way of looking at the UN. And again, even if you have a top management who is not really embracing the value, but you have the grassroots embracing it, it's already for me hope. And I know there, we have like different generation, but you have young generation, middle generation, and I think the UN, despite all the difficulties that is going through now because of the geopolitical challenges, because of all the economical challenges, because we are really not very happy financial situation, I think the UN, the young generation can still push for the values, and the value will remain in the organization, and the international civil servant will be the main vehicle behind this value. So my message is, even if we have senior management who really don't embrace all the values because of the political pressure they are under, you have middle staff, you have junior staff who can still lift up the organization and make it continue on the basis of the values for which it was put in place.
Thank you, Mrs. Cummins. So you are addressed by Mrs. Shawi in a certain way. So you should defend those values. And are you ready in the future or today already? I don't know if you had already pressure in your at your stage, but are you ready to resist to those pressure? Do you think it's a priority? Or you talked about neutrality being not absolutely the absolute value that you wanna that you think is at the root of your engagement. So how do you feel considering all those pressures?
I think it's absolutely essential to defend the values at the core of the UN. It's one of the reasons actually I'm a member of Fair Internship Initiative and trying to actually get the UN to truly walk the talk on the values that supposedly it defends. So for me, yes, I mean, everything I do is, in my mind, in somehow contributing to the realization of the values that I hold dear and which align quite well with the UN's values. And so I haven't, at this point, as a young intern, experienced any pressure to truly defend those. I've been very lucky to have supervisors that have supported me in my participation in climate activism, in my Fair Internship Initiative work. But I can understand that moving forward, getting into more senior positions as opposed to potentially more middle management, it does become more difficult to defend those and more delicate to defend them as well. But I think that, I mean, if you don't defend them, it's almost like they don't exist and they're not serving any purpose at all. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let's perhaps be a little bit more general and go to the main question of this panel. So, failures and successes of these 100 years of international civil service. You studying this question. What, in your view, is, I don't know, I'll let you the choice. Do you want to start with failures, which is very negative, or successes?
Well, sorry.
Yes.
I might give you an overview of whatever we studied at school, but I'd rather not, because there are people who are much more qualified than me and can bring real experience in here. So I would call a success of the UN the reason why I'm here, actually, in Geneva, because there's a reason for that. And I've been here for 2 months. I'm studying European international governments, and I aspire to be part of the UN next year when I graduate. The reason for that is exactly because of the values that you were talking about before. Prior to this education, I was studying business, and my system of values back then was completely different. If you would ask me what my ambition would be, it would be to make a lot of money and, go to an island. And then I grew up a little bit and I understood that that's really not very fulfilling on the long run, philosophically, like speaking. So then I was trying to find a way to make myself fulfilled and feel important. And I decided that this table here in Geneva and the values which you were talking before are worth being part of and worth defending if ever there's a time when they're put into question, so.
Is there anybody else in the panel who can tell us about success, failure? Yes?
Yes, I mean, we seem to love to look at our failures, but, if you look back either 100 years or the UN, there's a general body of shared values which did not exist. It did not exist before 1919. It's got different elements there. If I look at it from the ILO's point of view, you have issues like forced labor, child labor, you have discrimination, you have... child labor is a very good example. Still about 30 years ago, governments could get away with just saying, look, this is cultural, this is development, this is, we can't, we can't afford it. They still sometimes get away with forced labor, saying that, well, we can't afford it, we don't have the money, we don't, and there are solutions. But by and large, we have a consensus that certain things should not be done. Child labor should not be used. Forced labor, which was the normal thing in colonies, should not be exacted. Discrimination is wrong. These things that really were seen then at the time of the Second World War with labor camps and racial discrimination, and so on. There's a belief that it is wrong. Take South Africa. It took 30 years. It took over 30 years, but it got solved. Now, whether then the solution is ideal, so that's a different thing. But there's a whole list of things that have got solved because of these joint shared values of the multilateral organization and the different mechanisms that we have there. So let's not forget
Thank you for this positive take of what was done in the area where you were in. And I was wondering if in the human rights, this sense of consensus is also a truth, and if the progress are real. I mean, could you have the same type of agreeing about death penalty being not a good way to punish people and become a consensus, or are we much further away from a consensus on these type of topics than on child labor, for example? I don't know if my comparison is very good, but how is it looking?
No, I'll give you an example from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I was representative of our office, because it's an interesting dynamic within the interactions of the Security Council and what was happening on the ground, is that we had 22 offices throughout the country when I was representative there, and we were getting reports from a few different offices that then when they would go to massacre sites and mass rape sites, that they were finding UN rations. And so we started looking at this, and because at that point in time, the Security Council had, in one of its resolutions, indicated that the UN should be providing support to the FARDC, the army of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so we did further research, and we saw that, in fact, we were just simply providing rations to all members of the FARDC. And so we began a process of documenting the massacres and what we were finding in terms of UN supplies. And that we took this investigation all the way through our own, through the UN peacekeeping mission there and to the Security Council. And we were able to get a new resolution passed that, people don't like the word condition, but conditioned the support of the FARDC based on their level of respect for human rights. And so we created a whole, let's say, documentation system that would show that officers that had not been engaged in human rights violations did get support. Officers that had been engaged in human rights violations did not get support and would not get support until there was actually a criminal investigation relative to their actions. That was a very difficult and painful effort over a couple of years. But that in the end, the values of the organization became the most important thing relative to our interaction with the state, and it actually has had a beneficial impact on the relationship and on the behavior of the FARDC. So I do think we can make progress, but that's not necessarily an easy path. But I did want to say something about failures, because I'm fairly new here to Geneva, and I have about 70 people that are in my branch, and I met every one of them, spent about an hour, and I was really very worried after spending that hour with all 70 of them about how they don't feel that they have a purpose, that they're related to the change values of our organization. And I haven't fully understood, where it's coming from, but we have a real problem because people aren't feeling that they're connected to those values, and they feel more limitation for one reason or another. And, I'm working on it, but obviously it relates to their connection to the actual purpose and to the autonomy, that, given the autonomy they need to actually get to where they want to go. So, I think we can, and we have, and we'll continue to make progress. But I am a bit worried about, the condition of the civil service at this moment here.
Mrs. Shawi, how are you feeling about this statement?
I just want to say that I like to see these things in a positive manner. And to answer your question, if the UN didn't exist, if the international civil servant weren't there, I don't think the world would have been where it is now. And I think I understand what he's saying, coming from the field to Geneva and seeing maybe staff in Geneva not really having the sense of purpose of the organization. But I think staff, what they're doing in the field is really great. Now, when it comes to the condition of service, and again, we used to be I am not going to dig into details, but I think some of you have heard what's going on here in Geneva about the salary cuts, about the shrinking of our condition of service. They are shrinking, unfortunately. They are shrinking because of many reasons, because the world is changing. The way member states are looking at the UN is changing, and I have to recognize that now some member states see the UN as this big machine that is not really able to advance and to do what it should have been doing, but it's doing a lot, unfortunately. And if you want to continue having the international civil servant continuing fighting, having a sense of, achieving the goals of the organization, you need to secure good condition of service for them. And I'm not going to enter into all the details, but all the conditions are getting every day. It's taking every day some small things. And I give you just an example. I was just recently in New York, and then I met, USG of management and other senior manager. And when I hear somebody like USG for management saying that we don't need, but it's not necessary to make your career from first day till the end in the UN. We don't need to have people on continuing contract all the time. We need to adapt ourselves to the external world, which has become a world of instability. Then if you bring these people on these conditions without any sense of appartenance, of being part of the organization, how you want them to give the best of them. You need to give them, I'm not saying the best condition of service, because we are an organization that has it has a lot of relevance when it works in the field, but you need to give me the minimum so that I can give you the minimum in return. When you come and you cut my salary 7%, all of a sudden unilaterally, how do you want to expect me to be all the time working with the same motivation? When you come and you tell me, I don't know, you just have to, but that your career in the UN, you have to do everything to get a promotion, because I'm sorry to say it, we are in what I call still a caste system. When you have some staff working on the general service, what we call in the UN, other than a P, other D, this is no more the word of today, And you need to have a lot of people who are competent, who join the organization with a lot of desire to contribute. And the system, how it's now, it's killing them. It's a system, for me, I'm sorry to use this word, it's a caste system where, for God's sake, you have somebody, because he's director, he's more valuable than a professional, or a professional more valuable than an assistant. All of us, we contribute to the UN today. All of us, we should continue to contribute, but we need also our organization to protect our condition of service. And member states need to know this very clearly, that our condition of service are very important if you want to continue serving the organization like we should.
Thank you. Strong words. Mr. Tapiola, I have two questions for you. First, to which caste do you belong? And second, are the rights of the labor respected in the organization itself? Because if I listen to Mrs. Shawi, we are kind of an edge here.
Well, when I came into the ILO, I was recruited as Deputy Director General. So I suppose that answers much of the case, or where I would belong.
Peace here, yeah.
But I recognize the problem, and there are some other elements to the problem also. We are discussing, and I think we should, that's normal, discussing as if everyone would be really a top-notch, first-class civil servant. And then we look at the different ways in which people are recruited into the organization, political recruitments from certain governments. There are other things. I've always been fascinated with the fact that both governments and others, they've got the they very often want to get rid of their internal problems by sending these problems to the international organizations. Then they send these problems to the international organizations, and then they complain that the international organizations don't function properly. I mean, you can't have it both ways. And we have, it's very difficult to talk about it, because there are a lot of people who, in a way, end up without, you can't blame people. I mean, but we do have deadwood. And we don't have, really, methods of getting rid of deadwood. So, and then when we get into situations where budgets have to be cut, you end up by cutting those that you actually would need. But this is a fairly normal normal situation. Right. As to labor conditions, I think that the conditions, if you compare them with international labor standards, by and large are good. But then, let's not forget one thing. We have had discussions on having collective bargaining and so on. All right. I've been involved in discussions on collective bargaining in the ILO, coming myself from the trade union side. I've often had to say that, look, it doesn't exist. You can't. Because if you really want to bargain about wages and working conditions, the basic ones, you need to bargain with the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly. And your Director General or Head of Personnel does not have the latitude as a private entrepreneur has, or even public. So it's actually, I can't see what the actual model of collective bargaining would be. I believe that in areas of consultation, negotiating different issues, there's a lot to be done. And we have active unions, we have active staff unions, which by and large do a good job. Sometimes they seem to forget that they are not actually in a position to be trade unions in the way that trade unions are out there in the world. And if you read about trade unions in the French press and compare that to the public service, you may come to very strange conclusions. But
thank you, Mr. Holland. Last question for you, and then we go to the audience. You mentioned that you're pretty recent in Geneva and that you made these discussions with all your staff, and is this lack of sense of purpose in the teams, is this a speciality, if I could say, of Geneva, or do you find that a little bit everywhere in the world? And what can you do against that? Is it inside the system, or is it to what is it linked, really?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's exclusive to Geneva, but I think it's a very bad case here. And why do I say that is because, if we look at studies on motivation, it's about autonomy, it's about purpose, it's about mastery, and you'd think, wow, the United Nations should be really easy at this. I mean, it should be just like exactly what we do. I mean, you even have gray cells, they keep doing their work after they're not paid, right? Because it relates to autonomy, purpose, and mastery. And somehow, within our own organization, we're killing this ability for people to connect to that purpose, to have the autonomy they need, and to really support them developing the tool set to be, really good at what they do. And so I think that there's something there, and there's so many factors that relate to it. And if you see it in the field, I would say it's because it becomes more of a job, and because it relates to a business model. Because people, they'll lose their purpose if they take first getting the funds to keep their project going. And so we've created a very difficult circumstance in terms of business model, especially in the development areas, because it's a very different way of funding than in peacekeeping or the humanitarian. But that in development, it's often from specific donors or the member state themselves. And this creates, a problem and confusion between us and McKinsey. Because if we have a business model that's about maintaining the money, or do we have a business model that relates to supporting and actively pursuing the goals and values of our organization? And that's a problem because once you have a job, you want to keep your job. And so we have a real contradiction because of often the business model that we're pursuing. But in Geneva, where a lot of people actually receive money from the regular budget, and the regular budget hadn't really been under threat until recently, the problem seems to really be their connection. Their connection to purpose is that, the bureaucracy spins around and they do what they're supposed to do, but they've lost a connection to how they're helping to facilitate a change. And then they get disheartened because they've been in the same position for 15 years and they're not seeing how they're progressing. And so but you can make a difference if you connect people better and you create partnerships between what people are doing here and what people are doing in the field, and you begin to show that there's an interrelationship. You can do it, but that it's not. We really do have a serious problem, but at least some of us are working on it.
Thank you. So I give you the floor, but one more question to the younger audience. Listening to what you just listened, how is it? What's the state of your motivation here?
I've actually received the advice that I should not stay in the UN and that I should instead go to the NGO or the private sector, see what it's like there, maintain my ambition, and then come back when I'm a little bit older and ready to slow down because the bureaucracy is slow. So that's always interesting and something to consider. One thing I would like to just briefly say about what you said, Carl, labour standards might be good for staff, but for consultants and for interns, unfortunately, they're not that great and need to be improved. Have to say that, sorry. But in terms of motivation, it is something that I am considering and that I need to think about. And I think that everyone who are coming into this do need to think about, because it's one thing to really internalize the values that you think the UN are working towards and wanting to do that, and then to come into it, and perhaps I've heard that it's more an issue with headquarters than in the field, because there's this kind of disconnect with actually seeing what you're working on actually be realized. And I've honestly felt that a little bit with myself. Some of the work I've been doing is very much at a broad UN system kind of coordination policy level, and that feels too abstract to really connect to what I want to do and what feels like it's making a real change. And I do feel like that part of the problem with that is the bureaucracy and the reality of needing to have this kind of consensus-based decision making, because we can't just, as the UN, say, well, based on our values and based on all of these universal charters, this is what you need to do, and so you're going to do it. It's obviously not that simple, and it shouldn't be that simple, because that then becomes obviously a bit of a global dictatorship, not good. But it's definitely also a struggle and something that I personally don't have an answer for myself.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have one word on this? Short word.
Yes. So, well, whatever the faults of the UN, it still remains the only organization that does what it does. So I really want to be part of that, but I think I will not start from Geneva, though. I think, yeah.
But you're here now.
I am here now, and I'm getting an academic preparation, but I think I would rather go to the field first. I'm still young, dynamic, and see what's going on there. I've seen the UNDP, for example. I've worked a little bit with the UNDP back in my country, and I really like the concept there. So I think I'll start from there, and then see in the future, come back and see what's going on in here.
Okay, thank you. So, are there questions in the room? I have a mic that somebody can just take the mic. Or... Let's start it. Voilà. Alors, une question. Ah, vous avez le micro. On y va alors. Ouais, pardon.
Thank you very much. Thank you I'm Sibylle Ruprecht of the Geneva Academy for Peace and Mediation. Thank you very much for your presentation and interesting discussion. A lot was said about the neutrality and the need for neutrality of the United Nations and its civil servants. Given the way the United Nations is financed and the system it is financed with, doesn't it somehow take away neutrality and make it subject, or maybe make it vulnerable to pressures?
Is your question addressing to somebody in particular, or who likes to? Okay.
Well, I mean, I think you can phrase that in many ways. You have pressure which is negative pressure, and then you have pressure which comes from the interest of governments to do things which are not necessarily negative. If you look at the whole history of technical assistance of the UN system, it is very much driven by the United States. It's very much driven by U.S. Foreign policy. It's very much driven by U.S. Cold War time policy. Now, at that stage, the U.S. values were probably closer to the UN values than, for instance, the values of the Soviet Union. But you always have to put that whole thing into a perspective. Personally, we have been. I mean, I've had to manage situations where, because certain topics linked to trade and labor standards have become politically important, and because they have got blocked in other places, we were doing a lot of those in the ILO, and we were doing a lot with voluntary financing. Now, what should one say? How many countries finance? Was the German decision at one stage, which was provoked by the consumer reactions to child labor and carpets and so on, was the German decision to give a large amount of money to the ILO to deal with child labor. Was that pressure? I mean, it came with a degree of expectations regarding personnel and regarding certain things. Later on, the ILO about 30 million first, and then the same over a period of time for core labor standards from the United States. What do you do? Shall we call this pressure? I think in many cases the art, after all, of what we're trying to do is to manage these things knowing that there are always own interests in everyone who gives money for international cooperation has an own interest. The question is, how do you balance it? How do you make it so that it's tolerable, that it doesn't become unacceptable or doesn't start changing governments, at least not changing them in the wrong way?
Thank you very much. Other question? Let's try to be short, all of us, so we can go for a few questions. So, yes, sir.
Merci. Thank you very much for interesting answers to questions. My name is Dražen Petrović. I'm Registrar of ILO Administrative Tribunal. But I have a question from what I know about international civil service. There is dilemma from Eric Drummond onwards, whether executive head should be more secretary or more general. And if it should be more general, with what means they could be generals? To what extent they can have their own political will, independent from member states or instructions from member states? And just to comment, there is much more international civil service than UN system. We have many organizations that are not career organizations, especially those involved in weapons, chemical weapons, atomic energy. They're 7 years mandate organizations, and they don't stay forever. So it's normal to have some of these people seconded. And why is that so? Or why we have two new groups on multilateralism, terribly influential, G7 and BRICS, that do not have secretariats at all? Why do we have this trend to get out from secretariats or international civil service? Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody wants to react? Mr. Holland? Or? Okay.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize this, but
you have to be short.
I'll be short. Yes, as far as I can see, every governing body or administrative body or so expects the Director General to listen to it. And everyone also expects the Director General to give, to solve the questions. So it's a schizophrenic situation because you're criticized if you do too much. You're criticized if you don't do enough. But you know, it's like every decision of these bodies. Usually they say that, well, write another paper. It's got to be shorter but more detailed.
Impossible job, if I understand. Yes, one question here, and then we take one here, and then I guess we have to move on to the next panel. So one question, sir?
Oui, merci. Nous allons passer à la langue de Molière pour donner l'impression qu'on est un peu à Genève quand même, non?
Avec plaisir,
hein?
On vous écoute.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Merci. Je suis un ancien fonctionnaire, j'ai travaillé au cabinet du directeur général de l'ONU et j'étais en charge des relations avec la société civile et les ONG, ce qui fait que c'était un peu comme Monsieur Tapiola. On a les ONG, la société civile qui vient derrière, on a les États membres qui viennent, et puis on a notre hiérarchie qui vient aussi. C'est très difficile et je pense que plus on est exposé à ce genre de situation, plus c'est difficile d'être neutre. Mais moi, je voulais vous rappeler un peu, je crois que vous avez tous dû lire, j'espère, le livre d'Albert Cohen, hein, Belle du Seigneur. Et si vous lisez les 100 premières pages, eh bien, si vous regardez comment ce personnage qui a... C'était Obéité, je crois. Malheureusement, moi, j'ai fait l'expérience. Au niveau où je travaillais, j'avais exactement la même situation avec des... Je ne vais pas dire qui, mais je constatais la même chose. Et c'est ça qui peut être grave dans le système multilatéral dans son ensemble, les Nations Unies, c'est qu'il y a beaucoup de difficultés à s'adapter au management moderne. Même si à l'intérieur, il y a beaucoup de cours, de formation, de travail en équipe, de déléguer, de gérer des conflits, le mode de travailler, la structure, elle est encore, permettez-moi que j'utilise l'expression, c'est une hiérarchie quasiment militaire. Vous allez de tout en haut jusqu'en bas, et puis vous avez une espèce de camisole de force qui vous empêche, et parfois vous recevez de la pression d'en haut, et parfois, eh bien, vous êtes très mal pris vis-à-vis de votre fonction, et vous avez de la peine à ça. Et je pense que la maison, aujourd'hui encore, elle vit un peu avec la même comme le roman d'Albert Cohen le démontre, et je constate, et je termine là, qu'aujourd'hui on refait le palais des nations, on le rénove, et puis la seule chose qu'on trouve à faire, c'est de tomber des murs pour donner l'impression que les gens sont dans la même salle, mais en fait la hiérarchie et la culture d'entreprise est la même.
D'accord, merci. Alors là, je pense que vous avez donné envie à plein de gens, tous ceux qui nous regardent dans le monde, sur Internet, des jeunes. Mais voilà, c'est une réalité. Enfin, c'est en point de vue à une réalité peut-être. Alors, une dernière question. Je pense que ça n'appelle pas forcément de commentaires. Ou quelqu'un veut réagir? Non. Last question. I'm sorry. The lady here was first. And
yes.
Okay, you will have the very last question. But we have to move on.
Okay,
lady.
Thank you very much. So I might be the only Chinese here, and I really hope to participate more in the UN governance. So my question would be that, as we all know, recently in Hong Kong there is a very serious protests there, and the conflicts between the residents will be one group they fight for the democracy, the other residents they want right to life, right to work, right to education. So in this situation, there will be a conflict between values. So my question would be, as an international organization or UN institutions, to solve these difficulties in practice, you think the value, to realize the values is the first, or to solve the problems is the first?
Thank you for the question. Who wants to answer? Okay, and you can complete afterward. So,
I think that this is something that we run into in terms of conflicts of values, but I think that it's not that difficult to resolve. Because first and foremost, our organization has to be faithful to our conventions, and that when we look at the conventions, we can see that, in fact, rights that are economic, social, and cultural rights do relate to political and civil rights. Not just rhetorical, they actually do interrelate in order to provide for, to achieve a better society. And so the discussions that we should have, if we were actually in Hong Kong having discussions, should relate to those with the government and with the protesters to speak about, well, what rights exist? And if you're protesting, are you actually violating the rights of others? And then how can we work together to achieve a better state based upon the respect of rights for everyone? And I think that while it's not an easy solution, it is something that's possible, and we've done it in many countries relative to protest. I mean, I can tell you protests in DRC and Colombia, these would shut things down, and this would be difficult for small business people. This would be difficult sometimes for large business people. But that the importance is that there also has to be an appreciation for the rights of one another. And if people are suffering in terms of, for example, in Buenaventura, the largest port city in Colombia, that had no drinkable water, and when they shut down the port for a month, well, the first reaction was for the government to send in, you know, the riot police and the military, and you had conflict. You had injury, you had killings. But the reality is that people were shutting down the port because they didn't have drinkable water. There was a real problem. And so we went through a very long negotiation process trying to get people to appreciate the rights of one another and resolve it based upon that framework. So it's absolutely possible to do. But I did want to say something about some of the others, and I'm sorry, I will be
Sure,
shorter.
please.
It's just, I absolutely agree that part of our problem relates to our inability to adopt new methods, and that we have really problems relative to doing what's most convenient relative to recruiting, as opposed to how to find the greatest integrity and competence. Because it's just we have to perform within a certain amount of time. So I mean, I think that's really important. And then secondly, that just because we have extra budgetary funds doesn't mean that undermines our impartiality. Is that political support for what we're doing is important. It's not just money, it's political support. So bringing that together is important. But it also creates, certain times, this great importance on producing results within a year. And we can barely recruit somebody in a year. So we have great tensions between these two things. So
Thank you very much. So I am very much under pressure because there are still people asking for questions. So I give you the last word, but very, very short, because then we have to go to the next panel who is waiting also and have very
Merci beaucoup. C'est dommage parce que, en tant que spécialiste du droit de la fonction publique internationale et praticien du droit de la fonction publique internationale, j'ai des choses très intéressantes à dire au propos des règles de conduite, les règles de conduite dont vous avez parlé tout à l'heure. Parce que j'ai exercé aussi défendre les fonctionnaires devant le tribunal et des Nations Unies et de l'OIT. Tout ce que je veux dire très brièvement, c'est que moi j'ai étudié ces valeurs, ces règles de conduite, le droit de la fonction publique internationale à l'université à Assas-Panthéon. Je l'ai exercé. Il y a un décalage entre les principes tels qu'on les a étudiés, tels qu'on enseigne à l'université, et la pratique. Mais pourquoi ? C'est pas toujours la mauvaise volonté de l'administration, mais d'après ma pratique et mon expérience, c'est surtout la méconnaissance de ces règles, de ces principes, le contenu. Parce que vous le savez très bien peut-être, une seule université au monde qui fait le droit de la fonction publique internationale, tout simplement parce que le professeur qui a créé ce diplôme, c'est un ancien qui défendait les fonctionnaires internationaux, qui est à l'origine des droits acquis, Maître Sicot.
D'accord, écoutez.
Donc, c'est le...
Bon. Je vais être obligé de vous interrompre. Je vous remercie. On a compris votre propos de cooptation, en quelque sorte, si je comprends. Mais vous aurez l'occasion d'en reparler tout à l'heure.
J'ai rien dit en réalité.
Pendant le cocktail. Et on va passer we're going to the next panel now. I thank you very much to all of you. Very interesting. That's a gift. Yeah, sure.
But you put it like on the other side of the bottle.
Okay.
Oui, pas de problème.
Thank you for this. There's a bottle right here, I guess, because the photographers want them down because they don't want them on the table. Merci beaucoup, c'est gentil. Volontiers. Merci. I suggest that we try to be a little bit shorter in the answers. I'm sorry, you have a little bit of shorter time, but we'll go over anyway. So, okay, I invite you to start for the next panel, ladies and gentlemen. Please, thank you. So, we have here 5 experts of the UN system, of the UN evolution. I went through your profiles. It's very impressive. I won't summarize them, but with different angles, you have really a lot of knowledge about this evolution of the system, and for sure talking about multilateralism is something that you are dealing with every day, I guess. So let's start. So the theme is what to do to support and strengthen the ICS in the current international context to defend the role of multilateralism. I'm sorry, in English it's difficult. Multilateralism. So let's start perhaps first time. Times are hard for the multilateralism. Everybody says it, but Mr. Pescanto just gave his own vision of multilateralism before. But I'd like to know how you define multilateralism. If I look into Wikipedia, for example, it says only it's the relation between free states and at least free states trying to find common rules. A bit short. So who wants to start? But just give us an idea, what is multilateralism and why is it relevant? In 30 seconds for sure. Yes, Mr. Brown, so you are working for the funds, the Future United Nations Development System.
Well, my definition of multilateralism would be to subsume the powers of especially the larger states in a grouping comprising smaller and medium-sized states in the interests of solving common global problems. 25 seconds.
Thank you very much. That was great. Is there another 25 seconds definition? Or out of you?
I think the point is that it's countries ceding some of their national sovereignty to a collective body to solve these. I mean, the ceding of national sovereignty has to be a central part of any discussion of multilateralism. And that's important because, there's a tendency, and I heard it this evening, in which, and it's a fault of international civil servants, to assume that nationalism is a bad thing. You cannot have good multilateralism if you have weak national states, because states have to be confident enough to be able to cede some of their national sovereignty to solve these collective problems. And the danger of kind of pitting a kind of internationalist value system against a nationalist value system is something that I heard a lot of in the discussion in the previous panel. I think that's a dangerous place to start the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard Kozel, right, you are the Director of the Division of Globalization Development Strategies at the Union Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Just to make that straight. So, question is for sure, and you just put it on the table, is multilateralism today really in danger, or is it a kind of a phantasmatic idea? Who would, perhaps Mr. Nordlund, can you tell us about that?
Thank you very much. And
from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Working in the legacy of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the second Secretary General. And perhaps relevant for this discussion, Hammarskjöld was not the first choice when he was elected Secretary General. He was not the second choice. He was not the third choice. He was not the fourth choice. He was the 11th compromise candidate that was chosen. Because there were sort of important powers that felt that they didn't want a strong Secretary General. They wanted a public servant and so on. And they eventually got something else. And it was a strong international civil servant because the charter and the values that it stands for is a strong position to be in. And I think, we have to sort of come back to that and recognize that those values and principles that the multilateral system stands for, that's a very strong position. Having said that, I think going forward and the legitimacy of the institutions and the multilateral system really, to a large extent, will depend on how we address the urgencies that exist on public and global goods. Kofi Annan called them the problem, the problems without passports. So there are a number of issues that we need to deal with, and that has to do with cybersecurity, it has to do with the environment, it has to do with migration, it has to do with inequality, etc. And the international multilateral UN system will be measured against how it addresses these problems, and it has to show its values in terms of in being instrumental in handling those crises and situations. And that will always be a challenge. But I think going forward, the multilateral system, more than ever before, is in need, because these problems are increasingly global public goods problems that needs to be solved.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Nana Kourashvili, same question for you. To what extent is we understand that there is a need of multilateralism for many different issues, but is it really under pressure and is it threatened today? How do you feel that? And is nationalism threatening or not multilateralism, as we just discussed further on?
Thank you. Let me bring my modest opinion from my NGO perspective, where I've been working for nearly 20 years. I think the main problem what multilateralism is facing today is that it has lost linkage with the people. Let me very briefly link to the previous panel discussion about neutrality and impartiality. What does it mean today? I think it has changed the meaning a lot, because we have seen a lot of cases then indifference, passiveness, doing nothing has been very well justified by neutrality and impartiality. But in fact, in reality, absolute neutrality and impartiality does not exist. And as very famous UN negotiator Mr. Pico once said, there is only one way of being impartial, it's being dead. So if you can avoid being impartial, you need to choose the right party. And in UN system, it's definitely we the people. If we do a small survey among world population and ask them about names of secretary generals, I'm sure less than 1% can give you a name. And this tells us something. There was only one exception, it was Kofi Annan, we'll know. We all see what was happening in media, in social networks, then he passed away last year. And it was not because of his reforms, his great initiatives, but just because he was one of us. And I had honor to experience it myself, that I met him in person as participant of one program 20 years ago, how he interacted with people. We all had the feeling that he approached us individually and really listened to our concerns. And I think it's very important to bring this value-based leadership to reinforce it in the UN system and to really recruit the people based on their soft skills, on their abilities to understand most vulnerable, because it's just because of them they are holding their position. And even if you are politically appointee, even if you have pressure from your government, you still have a choice. And you should remember that even countries' contributions are making UN budget. These contributions are made of the taxpayers' contributions. And world population is the one who pays for UN, and the UN was created to serve people.
Thank you. Mr. Toraman, you have on one side, let's be precise, you have Donald Trump on one side, who is not especially the multilateral type. And on the other side, we have a Secretary General who is supposed to defend multilateralism, and another many other countries who do it too. Is there really how would you describe this tension between the two? And for sure, Mr. Trump is not alone. And is it a fight? How will this evolve in the next years? And can you see a winner in this at the end?
I think it is possible that the issue is maybe not that there is one winner and one loser, but there is the possibility that everybody could win if the United Nations or if the Secretary General would be able to explain to the common people or to the supporters of politicians like Donald Trump that the things that they feel that the United Nations threatens them are not a threat. For instance, things like migration, or I think it is possible to explain for the Secretary General that the work of the United Nations improves the situation in the countries where people origin from as migrants, and therefore the better the situation is in these countries, the better the rule of law is, the better the economic situations are in these origin countries, the less there will be an incentive to move to migrate to countries like the United States or in Europe, where these movements cause amongst certain political parties and certain politicians issues.
Yeah, I understand. But are you sure that Mr. Trump or others in Europe too would listen to that? I mean, it's a very reasonable way of explaining the things, but in what position is the UN today to persuade the world that multilateralism is really the way to go? Perhaps Mr. Brown?
Well, I won't answer that directly, because in some ways, the health of multilateralism is a complete accident. If you take the most powerful three countries which dominate the Security Council, because they're the only ones the three countries which use the veto very regularly, as opposed to Britain and France, which never use the veto, we're sort of in an accidental period where we have those three countries led by autocrats. It was not always so. In the 1980s, there were times of Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping. I mean, there were those three countries were led by much more committed multilateralists. But let me say something else. So basically, the answer to your question is, let's wait and hope that autocracy will have its day, and by an accident which the UN can do absolutely nothing about, that the characters of those leaders change. But I want to say something else about nationalism and multilateralism. It isn't a simple trade-off. The United States has always been a strongly nationalist country, but it dominated the UN, and it used the UN very much for its own ends. The baton has now passed because Trump is he talks about making America great again, which is very eloquent. That's what every president has always wanted to do, but it's never quite expressed the same way. The baton has moved to China. China is an arch multilateralist, but China has a way now, through the way that it spends its funds, the way that it puts forward candidates for the highest positions, of dominating the UN. And it's now filling the space which used to be filled by America. The change in the agenda is important. It basically means, with all due respect to our representative here, human rights is of no interest to China, which is why China, which has the stewardship of the development agenda by having the head of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs and the head of the division of the SDGs, you'll find in the current development agenda, human rights do not figure at all.
Yes, so reactions here, Mr. Nordlund and then Mr. Kozul-Wright.
Well, while I agree on this, and it's late, so maybe on a more positive note, saying that I think the multilateral, we have to reverse our thinking sometimes and see that the multilateralism has achieved tremendous things lately, and I think Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals is one of those achievements, because that is really, while it's a very comprehensive agenda, it can only add to already existing human rights conventions and deepen those. And it is an agenda of mutual accountability. It applies to all the countries. All the countries represented in the room here are obliged to implement these goals, and that's multilateralism working at the national level. And it's also one way, I think, to have a conversation about values and how we look at that at national and international level. It can be an arena to have that kind of a discussion. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Speaking to the title of this panel, I think also that the quality of the international civil servant is extremely important to make Agenda 2030 happen. And it was interesting to hear the previous panel say when you come into office and you get your passport, there is no education. What does it mean to be an international civil servant? And I think that will be critical for the quality of implementing Agenda 2030. I think we know from research that quality of government in terms of being an impartial civil servant at the national level corresponds very strongly to good development. And that defined very narrowly. If you're objective, neutral in relation to the laws and the policies of that country in the implementation, you'll have better development in that country. And I think the same applies to the UN. And it's not neutrality doesn't mean that you have to find the middle ground all the time. Neutrality means that as long as you stand true to the Charter and the legal restrictions that apply to the UN, the decisions and the actions you take after that are okay, even if you then face conflict and there will be pushback from certain interest groups. So neutrality doesn't mean that harmony or that we all have to get along. It's something stronger than that.
Thank you. Is that Kaza right? You wanted to write?
Yeah, again, the dialogue that we've heard this evening, 100 years, there's this kind of implicit assumption that we've had this 100 years of multilateralism in which it's basically been more or less the same thing that we've been talking about for 100 years, or it's gradually been an improvement of beginning with Drummond and then in a kind of Whiggish way getting better and better until Donald Trump came along and the thing fell apart. And that's clearly a very fictitious history, right? I mean, I'll have to read John's book. I promise I'll do that. But however good the League civil service was, it screwed up when it came to the economics of the interwar period. The League was part of the problem during the interwar period. The kind of understanding it had, including people I assume like Drummond, had of the problems of the interwar economy, were part of the problem. They were not part of the solution. When I look at, I haven't got my head around the 75th anniversary of the UN yet, but we are this year celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions. And I, having the pleasure of going to Washington twice a year and going again this year, there was this celebration of the assumption that what the IMF and the World Bank are doing today was essentially a continuation of what the fund and the bank were set up to do in 1944. And this is, of course, absolutely nonsensical history, right? I mean, and you can see it when you listen to what the founders of Bretton Woods thought they were doing. And if you take someone like Henry Morgenthau, who was the US Treasury Secretary, who was ultimately responsible for selling the Bretton Woods Agreement to the US Congress. So he goes to the US Banking and Currency Committee in 1945 to sell this agreement, which he knows is a difficult sell because of what you said. The Americans have this they don't have a great feeling for the multilateral agenda. So he goes there, sells it as an American agenda, but it's very clear, because he was a multilateralist, what the intent of Bretton Woods was. And he sets out 3 principles, essentially, to what is and I look at this from an economic perspective, obviously. What is a healthy economic multilateral system? Number one, to have a healthy economic multilateral system, you've got to control finance. You cannot have a healthy global economy if you have unregulated, unruly finance. And the Bretton Woods system, in one way or another, was an attempt to put speculative finance back in the box, because it had such a destructive effect in the 1930s. Second of all, you need to make sure you have a set of rules that give national governments enough policy space to be able to meet the various demands, often conflicting, of their citizens. So creating a set of rules that gives governments these policy space is essential to a healthy multilateral system. And thirdly, you have to have a set of rules that make sure that what Morgenthau called economic aggression and bullying by the strong of the weak is somehow mitigated, if not ruled out altogether. So those are the 3 principles that Morgenthau sets out in 1945 about what they thought they were doing at Bretton Woods and what constitutes and on each of those principles today we have the opposite. We have a financial system that is clearly dominating the real economy and screwing up people's lives in multiple ways. We have an attempt by the multilateral system to cut down on the policy space of developing countries, whether that's through intellectual property rights or through the international trading system, through investment agreements of one kind or another. And we have a system in which unilateral sanctions are tolerated, if not encouraged. In this system. So we have the opposite, and none of this is anything to do with Donald Trump. Donald Trump has nothing to do with any of those 3 distortions of the multilateral system as it was designed. So, get real. Stop focusing on Trump as the problems.
So if I understand, Donald Trump is a kind of feuille de vigne, as we say in French. He's covering a problem. And
this is an excuse for the failures of European social democracy. Right. That's what Donald Trump
So what you're explaining here is that the Bretton Woods institution, who are still here, I mean FMI and the World Bank are still there, did a total failure, if I understand, and the international system in its global was unable to correct or try to stay in a positive system, economical system that was working better in 40 years ago than, or let's say 60 years ago, than today. So what is your...
Really, they're not, if you're Goldman Sachs or a large digital monopoly, they're not failing at all. They're setting a set of rules that make your lives very difficult and allow you to make...
They don't fail, but the institutions fail. The international institutions failed in doing what they intended to do, if I understand you, no?
Well, what they were originally set up to do in 45, they are, yeah.
Okay, now, there are a lot of new things came up in these last decades. And one thing that came up, and we just mentioned it before in the last panel, is the strengths of civil society. So I really, this is a real question. What is the input and the impact of this growing power of civil society through the digital tools that exist today, social networks, etc.? What does it have any influence on the multilateral system? Because it has a huge power. It's very, very powerful. Is this who would like to answer on this? Yes, Mr. Drummond.
I think that is, as you have said, it is a huge power because it has something I think that the UN lacks, and that is the power to mobilize people, to create enthusiasm, to create energy, and to create a drive to that can change and sway opinions in the member states, and through that also change what the member states demand or what their expectations are in the United Nations. So I think it is an essential tool to sway or to change or to course correct if one thinks that the important member states have an incorrect opinion or interests.
Just something to say about that?
Yes, I think civil society is one of the main partner of UN in at least in three main pillars: in human rights, humanitarian assistance, and development field. There sometimes in countries, UN itself is even perceived as some big NGO because there is so many partnerships and so many things which are done together, and definitely contributing a lot to the development of these countries. So I think then UN is criticized maybe quite fairly, but on the other way, quite unfairly as a homogeneous institution. We should always remember, as our favorite Professor Brown taught us at the university, there are 4 UNs, and I think what 3 others, except for Security Council, is doing is really the huge contribution of the world development today. So I think what UN needs to be investing more and more, how to strengthen these 3 pillars which really create its image in the world. And in these regards, again, I will repeat that stronger linkages with population and with we the people is really essential. Sometimes people think that the ones who are working in the missions, they are on the ground. But more often, these are the people who are just having opinion, looking from the windows of their fancy offices, in most cases in the capitals, but don't really have direct interaction with most vulnerable, those interests they should be serving. So this needs to be addressed, and civil society really has a crucial role because they are the ones who represent the people. And if we look back at these 100 years of multilateralism, only the initiatives were successful and really survived over this century, which were really dealing with people.
Thank you. Yes?
On this important subject, if I may, yes. If I can just relate this to the work we've been doing as part of the future UN development system. So the 4th pillar, the development pillar, is very important to civil society, obviously, but the other way around also. We've talked about the agenda, which is around the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The success of those goals will depend very crucially on the activities of civil society, particularly at the national level, as independent and objective monitors of progress. And I think the more that the UN, and I think it's true, I mean, in contrast to what you began to say earlier, I think that the civil society has actually found its way into the UN much more comprehensively than certainly when the UN was set up originally, even though civil society did play a part in that. But I think the success of these goals will be in independent monitoring of those goals. And if I can just say, our vision of the future UN development system is not to be engaged in thousands upon thousands of small projects, standalone projects, but to be involved operationally in helping countries particularly with the assistance of civil society, to meet and implement the norms which their governments have already agreed in the UN forums.
Thank you, Mr. Nordlund.
Thank you. Yes, I think the UN has a few tools at its disposal that can be used and that needs the involvement of civil society very much. One is the convening power. We know that from the UN. This is a unique platform in that sense. We know of all the big conferences and processes around them. The second is around goal setting, Agenda 2030 being the most prominent example right now. And the third is around how to generate and use data to follow up and monitor progress on this. And I think for this process to be credible, both in terms of being having that convening power and bringing the peoples into the conversation, and also to follow up on the global goals that we have now. I mean, social media, civil society, citizens' engagement through those channels would be absolutely critical to the implementation and legitimacy of this process.
Thank you. Perhaps a last question to all of you before we go to the audience. There is since the start, actually, almost, there is a discussion about reforming the UN. If you had one decision to take to make today a better UN from the inside, what initiative would you take? Very briefly. Mr. Brown.
25 seconds. I would ensure that the Secretary General has a single term of 7 years and not 2 terms, because as the first term wears on, the Secretary General, the incumbent, always wants to ingratiate himself. It's always a him with the big member states in order to ensure he gets a second term. A single term. It's the one important reform in a process of rather active reform in the selection of the last Secretary General that wasn't realized, and I think it should be.
Thank you. Mr. Kozuvait?
I like that. I mean, just to respond to what was I would ask the UN to take a serious look about how it deals with groups like civil society and business. The idea that civil society represents the people is just a preposterous idea, right? Civil society is a hugely homogenous group of individuals, many of whom are funded by somewhat dark money. And the idea that we can just say civil society represents the people is actually a very dangerous kind of position, I think, to take. And I think the UN needs to revisit its whole conception of partnerships and what those mean, because at this moment in time I think they're distorting the operations of the system and not doing very much for multilateralism in general.
Who's next? Thank you. Mr. Nordlund.
Well, I would largely disagree on that position, but that's perhaps a separate discussion. I think my point was also civil society and citizens. And I think the social media, the technology development that we have allows for that kind of involvement much more than before. But that was not my point. My point on the one thing to do, I would look on the internal side. Look, there are many UN identities: humanitarian, development, peace building, etc. I think would be crucial to try to go back and find what is the esprit de corps of the UN system. And that speaks to the international civil servant that we're discussing today. I think that discussion needs to take place. I think we are, for example, at the foundation, we're putting together a booklet with the key UN documents that speaks to what it means to be an international civil servant in the UN system. There is no such one publication. And we will try to contribute with that. We're also putting out next year a leadership, what it means to be a leader in the UN system. And that's not just a leader at the highest political levels. That's if you're an international civil servant, you're a leader. So what does that mean to people? So I think revisiting that discussion, I think some of the key issues that we can speak to at the foundation has to do with what it means to be a value-based organization, leading on principles, etc. But leadership is much broader than that. But that would be my take. Return to the international civil servant and the esprit de corps of the organization.
Thank you. Mrs. Koashvili? The initiative you would take.
Yeah, I think I've been repeating it quite a lot today that, I would think of some mechanism. It's hard to formulate it in this short time of the direct communication with people because I think it's the biggest reward for your professional career. Then you directly see the people, those lives you changed and those lives you touched.
Thank you. Mr. Drummond.
Maybe I can mention something that I wouldn't change instead of the one thing that I would change, because I've been hearing very often, or we are hearing very often, that the one thing, the silver bullet to improve the UN would be to abolish the veto rights in the Security Councils. But I've also heard many arguments why this wouldn't improve the functioning of the Security Council at all, because there are other councils where there is no veto power and they don't work much better than the Security Council.
Okay, so no solution, if I understand about. Okay, turn to the audience. So questions. Let's take one question here, sir.
Thank you. My name is
just in the mic.
I joined the UN in 1976, and I'm one of the few people who actually took their oath of office with the Director General of the UN in Geneva. I'd like to make a comment on the way we look at the UN. It seems to me that institutions always lag behind how society evolves. And I think we're facing this institutional lag big time with the UN. The UN represents nothing to do with we the peoples, it's we the states. And it's a state system as it was in 1944, 43, when big minds started looking at the way in which the UN might be set up. I think what has happened is that no state now is able to deal with transnational problems that are affecting the way in which the world works, whether it's the GAFAs, whether it's the financial flows, whether it's climate change, whether it's human rights. And I think that this disconnect between the reality of the world outside and an organization that has no transnational powers is going to become more and more big as time goes on. I would like to make a comment also on the discussion on human rights, because it seems to me that when we talk about the international civil service, we also have to talk about the example that comes from the top. And I think that on the specific issues of human rights, I can think of Sri Lanka, I can think of Myanmar, the message has not come from the top. And the nice words that after Sri Lanka, the Secretary General made about human rights up front being the lifeblood of everybody working for the organization, that has not changed because to a large extent, senior staff in the UN, and I was kind of a medium senior staff, do not think that human rights is something that they need to pursue in their work, or gender rights or PSCA issues.
Thank you. There's more, yeah, Madame. Yes, just push on the button.
Yeah, here it is. I'm from UN, I've been there long enough, and I've seen changes, and it is changing, believe it or not, but I just want to say a word on civil society. But civil society has got an immense impact right now. It's interactive with all the UN programs and activities, and especially the younger generations, because if you say that civil society is dirty money and special people who get together, NGOs who are financed by whatever, it's not true. Even if it's an NGO, anybody in the world can be a member of an NGO. So there is still a bit of human rights idealism, wanting to do better, trying to change the world. I think NGOs are playing a very, very important role right now, and I think they should be given importance, consideration, financial means, and also. I don't want to go any further, but UN is fundamentally changing. That I can really say. And as far as the Secretary, the big thing is to break the veto of the 5 Security Council people, and especially the governance in the Middle East. Some of the big chiefs over there, they do not want to change the system into democracy. But as far as changing the Secretary General after 7 years, I don't believe that is the problem. I think the problem is to have a think tank, a collective governance at the head of the UN, and with everybody participating in a meaningful, full, and functional way to the goals and objectives of the UN. I don't think the head of the UN does count a lot, unless, of course, he comes from a dictatorship country, and also if Mr. Trump paid his dues, voila, that would put things into the right direction, because UN is being solicited every single day by millions and millions of cases, and there's no way. Yeah. So if US doesn't pay.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, just an interesting point is what is actually the weight of the Secretary General in this system? Listening to some of you, it seems that it has a huge importance. Is it really the case, or is he not just depending from what the states want? Who wants to take that?
Yeah. No, one of my colleagues here will. But I do want to respond to what this lady was saying and resolve this disagreement that seems to be about the role of civil society organizations. There is a system whereby civil society organizations are vetted in order to get accreditation to ECOSOC. And I think that's very important. And that should weed out the active civil society organizations and NGOs, which are more like the profile that my neighbor was talking about. There's a danger, though, and I think that the process of accreditation is becoming politicized in a rather sinister way, but through the influence of some of those three big powers that I was referring to. That is very dangerous. So if the CSO is going to continue to play this very, very important role, the process of accrediting CSOs and NGOs to the UN must remain absolutely objective and in line with the values of the UN and not with the interests of the P3.
Okay, do you want to react shortly?
I mean, just think about the SDG. What we're talking about, realistically, is the single largest investment push. This is way beyond the Marshall Plan, which in itself was a tremendously successful aid program. We've done our own calculations in the order of $2 to $3 trillion a year for developing countries alone. But when you put in climate into that, it's even bigger. So we're talking about this huge investment push. And the UN has, simply listing having a list of nice things that we all agree to, which is what the SDGs are, is one thing. Actually being able to think how you mobilize those resources to actually deliver in a meaningful way and in a meaningful time frame is another thing altogether. And civil society has very little to say or do about that. This is an issue for policymakers and international institutions. And the UN is failing on that, clearly failing on that front. It's kind of fixated with trying to bring in the private sector because it believes that somehow public goods are delivered by private finance, even though they never have been historically. And that's where we need to have this debate. And I talk about monitoring as being the only issue and getting the statistics right is actually pretty much beside the point. This is a massive public policy challenge, and unless the UN faces up to the fact that the last 30 years of kind of simplistic neoliberal policy advice has failed to even deliver investment in its own countries, the idea that it's going to do that to ensure that we get these 17 goals delivered seems to be pie in the sky, and I don't think civil society has helped very much to address those kind of issues. I really don't.
Sorry, I have to respond to that. If UNCTAD would work with civil society more effectively to ensure that the $500 billion that is bled out of the African continent every year through licit and illicit financial flows, we would solve the resources problem of the SDGs.
Let's go. Thank you, sirs, for these very interesting exchanges. One more question here.
Yes, thank you very
much.
Yes, not in English because I may think that some of you don't speak. En français, tu veux que je le dise en français? En espagnol, en espagnol.
Anyway, let's start.
Bon, alors je reprends en français puisque j'étais responsable du statut ECOSOC à Genève. Je connais très bien le fonctionnement du comité. Heureusement, à l'ONU, il n'y a pas que le statut ECOSOC. Il y a une multitude de possibilités pour les ONG de travailler de manière diversifiée. Mais je voudrais vous rappeler quand même qu'en 2004, le secrétaire général Kofi Annan a lancé une étude avec l'appui de M. Cardozo. Et je vous suggère de lire le rapport de Cardozo, 2004. Le rapport Cardozo a voulu changer le mécanisme de travail global de la société civile avec le système multilatéral, qui n'a pas voulu changer une seule virgule à la manière de travailler, les États membres. Aucun État membre n'a décidé, enfin si, globalement, il y en a quelques-uns, mais depuis, avec un rapport si important qui voulait faire ce que vous disiez, une seule porte d'entrée pour la société civile avec des critères objectifs, les États membres n'ont pas voulu. Pourquoi? Parce qu'ils veulent contrôler la société civile selon l'UNDP, selon l'UNICEF, selon les COSOC, selon les droits de l'homme. Et ça a rendu la chose difficile parce qu'on n'a pas une définition internationale de société civile et on n'a pas effectivement une société civile élue qui puisse faire, disons, faire partie du système comme un pilier. Et le jour où on arrivera à ce que la société civile soit un pilier de l'ONU, là, on aura une véritable participation pour la gouvernance mondiale.
Merci. On va prendre une dernière question, parce qu'on va devoir avancer, on a déjà pris un peu de retard. Alors, allez, 2 questions, monsieur et madame, ou madame et monsieur, laissons la place là.
I just want to say, if we are for values, but some of our values are linked to democracy, then we have a certain attitude to société civile and to our outreach to the société civile. So through democracy, the société civile is speaking, is electing in the best of cases, its own representatives. And these are sitting together and making policy. Now, taking the SDGs, I do believe that if the SDGs will see the light of the day and will get the financing, the only way is to get the message through to the civil society and work with civil society to get the demand for the investment through in the countries themselves. So there is no other way but the working together with société civile. And I think the approach is that the countries themselves need to understand what they can do and what they can demand in order to get the investment in. So I think that approach is the right approach, and the more we get of it, the better I think the multilateralism will work overall.
Thank you. Very contrasted views. Sir in the back.
Yes, hello. Okay, I'm Anders Johnson. I work at the ILO. I'm just curious, I just want to quickly read again the actual title of the panel, which was What to Do to Support and Strengthen the International Civil Service in order to defend the role of multilateralism. Because when I speak to a lot of people in sort of who are not at all in the UN system, the criticism I hear a lot is that civil servants, international civil servants, seem very distant. And that, for example, I keep being asked because of the ILO where I work at, you know, if you're working on helping SMEs, how many of the people there have actually run an SME? I mean, so my question to you then is, should we be rethinking how we hire people in the UN, civil service? And how should we actually sort of go about that to make sure that the people who are working at the international level have experience, or at least have the ability to connect with, as you said, we the peoples, in a way that they can actually communicate to them what it is that we're doing?
Who would like to answer? Sir.
I feel that one thing that is very important that can be done rather easily is to go out for these officials and to talk with the people who they see on the street, or to go into classes, into school classes, into universities, and to present themselves and say, what is it that the UN does? What is it that our organization does? And if the people see that the officials are made out of flesh and blood and not just robots or soulless interests based on working based to represent interests, that will also change the perception, I believe. So I think one thing that has to be done is to go out and to talk with everybody.
But should that therefore be incentivized as part of your job?
I doubt that the UN would have the resources to do that, but I think it should be mandatory to have some sort of PR to go out, and because even though the work is being done, if the people don't know that the work is being done, that's what's creating this negative perception. So I think it should not only be incentivized, in the best case it should be mandatory, but obviously the resources are scarce.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. Very interesting panel. Thank you. And now to conclude, we have the Vice President of Grey Cells, Mrs. Manuela Tortora, who also was very active organizing all this. Give you the floor for the final word.
Okay, good evening. I would like to talk about science fiction, and particularly about a novel of science fiction by Herbert George Wells, The Shape of Things to Come. It was published in 1933, and it is a science fiction novel that describes the international relations system between 1933 and the year 2105. It starts by announcing the next World War. We are in 1933, announcing that the next World War will start in January 1940 at the border between Germany and Poland. Remember, it is published in 1933, a little bit before. And it predicts that this conflict, this world war that will start in January 1940, will last during many decades and will be far worse than the First World War. It will lead to the total collapse of all nation states, all governments in the globe, all empires, all politicians, all political systems, all national institutions totally collapse into a general chaos. After a few decades of this chaotic situation at the global level, a World Council emerges. It is formed by scientists, experts, technocrats, engineers, academics, all of them acting based on their own knowledge and expertise and delinked from any national state, because nation states collapsed. This World Council manages, after a while, to take the direction of the reconstruction after the World War, to reestablish order in the first place, to reestablish governance, to organize the management of natural resources all over the world, and particularly, based always on knowledge and expertise, to manage what the novel calls the common goods without any border. Far before Kofi Annan used the same vocabulary. The collapse after the World War is called, in the text in the novel, the common suicide of the sovereign powers. And it is a new modern world state with new modern officials that are taking the control of this World Council. So we have a new sort of international civil servant. They are called officials of the new world state. And the common goods that they have to manage, as I said, is not only natural resources, but more and more health, transportation, communications, education. And in the philosophy of the World Council, there is also one thing which I think is worth reading, the definition of truth, which is one of the pillars of the World Council. Truth is defined as follows. The code
of the first makers of the world state had been a simple one. Tell the truth, they insisted. Maintain the highest technical standards. Control money and do not keep it. Give your powers of the World Council ungrudgingly to the service of the world state. So this World Council also manages to abolish all sorts of nationalism. Of course, it is the bad nationalism, not exactly the sort of good nationalism that was mentioned here in this panel a while ago. And it is because of that that they become successful with the strong support of non-state actors all over the globe. They establish a world cooperative society, and these international civil service servants call themselves citizens of the world. Now, there are three conclusions that I would like to flag that emerge from the novel itself. They are mentioned in the novel, actually. The first one is that in the novel, in that context, remember we are in 1933, the nationalism and multilateralism are not compatible. Wells insists on that all over the places in the novel, because he says, in a world of common goods, nationalism and multilateralism cannot, in this context, be compatible. Again, bad nationalism. The second conclusion is that he says, in order to be efficient, this new generation of international civil servants have to be delinked from any national institution, as it used to be before the conflict, the catastrophic conflict. And they have to really insist on using their knowledge to formulate their policies. And the third conclusion is that these international civil servants manage gradually to transform the behavior and the mindset of human societies so that there are no more wars. Now, this is science fiction, of course. It is an utopic vision of the world. But 100 years ago, the establishment of the League of Nations and the creation of the International Civil Service was also science fiction. It was an utopic vision. And still, we are here talking about it 100 years later. That demonstrated, at least partially, even the utopic science fiction vision can be somehow become a reality. Thank you very much. I just wanted to reflect on that.
Well, I wouldn't like to keep you from going up to the Maison de Maître and have a nice cocktail that is waiting for you. So I'm going to be extremely brief and just go through very shortly to a few points. One of them is we started with Geneva, which is an incredible place. It has been mentioned that this is the smallest big city in the world, and there are many things that happen in Geneva, in the international world and in the private sector. I'm an actuary by profession, specialized in pension schemes, Social Security pension schemes, but the rest of my colleagues, they work on banks and private pension funds in Geneva and in Zurich. And I can tell you, none of them expect to have a full career in any of the banks or the pension funds that they are working. And none of them had a better healthcare system than I had at the ILO. So rotation and turnover in the private sector, it's the rule right now. Flexibility, it's the rule in the rest of the world. That's an issue. And of course, we are gray cells and we are gray, but we were not like that all the time. We were young. I came in Geneva 40 years ago only, and I changed countries 7 times. So I had to pay a very high price, particularly my family, for being here. And of course, I would like to make a distinction between something that we discussed yesterday, the contracting situation and the contract I had, and the job that I have. And the job, being an international civil servant, it's a unique and fantastic opportunity if you keep, as the young participants were mentioned, you keep to the values. That is fantastic. And also, things are changing all the time. I have just noticed changing all the time. I have a theory that life expectancy of ministers in most countries in the world is something like 2 years. 2 years, because they change. They become ministers and then they leave. They become ministers, and there's a multilateralism and balancing independence. It's always with a different crowd, and it was mentioned. Now we have very particular leaders all over the world, but our different levels, we have different government leaders all over the world, and you have to act. So I'm optimistic anyway. I don't know if you saw the film yesterday, any of you, which I liked it very much. Someone has an accident, wakes up, and he just discovered that nobody has heard any music from the Beatles. So he starts recording the Beatles, and everybody says, "You're a genius, you're a genius. What would happen?" And I immediately thought, what would happen if all of a sudden United Nations was not there? What the world would be, even with all the problems, even with all the limitations, what the world would be. And I think it would be a nice picture that we would have. So I hope that with something that was mentioned in your note and in some of the documents that are distributed at the entrance, we need to have a new generation of goodwill based on democratic concepts, and to have better and stable and coherent governments that have an impact in the United Nations. So at the end of the day, I am optimistic. I feel a little bit like when John presented his book at the library, that we could discuss this for hours and hours and hours. And I'm happy, because it seems that there are so many things that we could discuss. And I will then now invite you to continue discussing at the cocktail upstairs. And thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you. See you up.